you're trying to convince the general public that these boys are innocent, don't quote a mob movie in which they then beat up a bunch of bikers at a bar.
Because if you don't do that, once you're in court, now you just can't leave.
And it seems quite obvious to me that this lawyer, instead of, presenting evidence that would help exonerate them in the public eye, like showing the actual security cam footage of when they came home or the text messages with Katie, no. Instead, we're going to keep it focused on race, which you can see by this clip.
People are pushing the narrative of, oh, this is a race thing. Well, obviously it's not. I mean, this is like a brother to us. I mean, Nolan's no different than anyone else in our group. I think it's so criminal that they took something so anti-racist and flipped it into something super racist. Like this is the definition of anti-racism. I mean, that we did not look at Nolan any different than I looked at him, or even you.
Okay, first off, that even you was wild. It's quite clear from that sentence that Jax has never had an actual conversation about racism in his entire life. I was friends with a black person. That's the most anti-racist anybody's ever been. This situation was the most unracist thing that's ever existed. It's the media. They're the ones making this racist. No, you don't understand what that means. It means your story doesn't hold water, and when people called you out on it and called out the investigation on not even investigating, that is systematic racism. It's very, very clear to me that the lawyer is the one telling them to keep the focus on race. Because you can see the lawyer and the gears in his head turning and nodding and agreeing along with all of the racial stuff. And you can see him kind of being like, yeah, okay, that's what I'm saying, yeah. So it's very clear that that was one of the bullet points that the lawyer told them to hit home over. And another one was the Coast Guard. Why would I call the Coast Guard if I knew he was dead? I called the Coast Guard right away. First off, you didn't. You waited till 11 o'clock. Second, it's not like the Coast Guard searched for him that night. Warren clung to that like it was a safety raft.
I think from the beginning, I'm glad that I called the Coast Guard. It would have been completely different. I'm glad I called the Coast Guard.
It's like, I'm sorry, Warren, but it's actually way more suspicious that you called the Coast Guard, because first, you didn't want to call the Coast Guard when you guys were sinking, and then for some reason, you assumed that Nolan was still out on the island at 11 o'clock at night. Why wouldn't you assume that he came back with the person he was supposed to come back with, and something happened to him in transit? Because no reasonable person would think that he was still out on the island, in my opinion. Because in your own words, Warren, you said you didn't talk to Katie till the next day. And then speaking of the island, the lawyer tries to say that by them going to the island and looking around, that it absolutely exonerates them and that the narrative couldn't be this, and ends it with a wild statement, mind you.
People who have been sucking up way more oxygen than they're entitled to have not been to the island. I'm willing to bet that a lot of the hustlers and profiteers and liars have not been to that island, and you have to go to that island. And being at the island today was revelatory. It was really illuminating. It's a very dynamic marine environment, first of all. But when you go to the island, you see instantly that what some people want to be true, what they wish to be true, they're trying to wish it to be true. They're trying to make it true through their lies. It's actually not possible. It is a very, very long and narrow barrier island. It's basically very low sand dunes. And the particular part of the island that we're dealing with, there are no trees. It's hardly any foliage, hardly any tree cover, hardly any plants, and it's wide open. And on July 4th, there were thousands of people there. There is no possible way that anybody could have committed a murder in broad daylight.
Murder? Who's saying anything about a murder? Most of us are under the assumption that an accident happened and they covered it up. All of this stuff that they keep trying to point to as evidence that they didn't do anything to him are not actually evidence. You know what is evidence? The security cam footage. Explain to us why the grandfather was the one who canceled the CETO. How about that? And what I see is just a complete lack of responsibility with these boys, because listen to this phrasing.
I wish we would have never, I think about this every day, I wish we would have never went out on the 4th of July, because I know this wouldn't have happened.
You see, instead of saying, I should have made sure my friend got home safely, they said, I wish we had never gone out. And I have to admit, my little antennas buzzed a little when it sounded like he was going to say, I knew this was going to happen, right? That seems like what he was going to say. It wasn't, maybe we shouldn't have been underage drinking. They literally say, we did everything right.
I mean, there's not much I would change from my point of view and my friend's point of view. I think we did everything right, and I know we did nothing wrong.
Those are not the words of somebody who lost their brother, their best friend, a month ago. And I lost one of my closest friends in a suspicious way, I blamed myself, even though I hadn't even physically seen her in a couple years. And for those of you guys saying that Jax is the one that people should press, I fully disagree. He is the one that I think is the scariest out of these interviews. Watch the way he looks at Warren during this moment.
We live in a very tight-knit community, and for people to, push back and say these things when they know what Ocean Springs is like, it's really hard. And I mean, I don't think I haven't had many personal encounters, but I know being around the
Oh, he felt like he was saying something to Warren. Because let's not forget, it was his grandparents' house that they all got together at. It was his grandparents' house that they went back to and thus should have security cam footage from. And out of all of them, Jax is the one that is holding his body in a different way, who is more controlled, more level-headed. If these kids were truly looking to exonerate themselves, they would actually start addressing some of these questions, like, who was the fourth boat? Why were all of you huddled up out there together? Who drove the fucking Palm Beach? Boy, they really didn't want you to see this video because they made it ineligible immediately so you wouldn't see it. So let's go through a speed run of the information. We can now definitively say that this is Jax. We can also now definitively say that this is Morgan. He's wearing the same hat as well as the same bracelets. So where were they on the Triton? Now that we've got a much clearer video thanks to Officer Tatum, it's obvious that there is nobody in an orange swimsuit or a paisley swimsuit on this boat. We also barely see that there's somebody here in the red shorts. Now in this Katie Snapchat picture, I've been saying that there was somebody in the background here wearing red shorts. So I pumped up the exposure, and as you can see, it certainly looks like it. They seemingly have similar body types as well as similar hairlines. We also know that whoever was in the red shorts was also on the shoreline when the fight broke out. Now who was involved in that fight? Warren's brother, Carter. Carter, who trains in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And by Warren's own admission, his brother put someone in an arm bar. And in case you don't know what that looks like, go ahead and look at that placement on the back of the head there. Spot look familiar? Given Carter's height, build, body type, this looks like it could be him. But one blurry, underexposed picture is not solid proof of anything, right? But we know Warren grabbed his younger brother and had him come over hang out with them on their boat as they were sinking or whatever. And it would be pretty bad for their case if this was Carter on the Triton and then on Katie's boat at 6 o'clock. But now my attention turns to this person who a lot of people think is Bart. But in his hand, he is holding a cell phone. So I thought, why would Bart jump from his boat to the other boat holding a cell phone when other people have cell phones in their hands while Wyatt is on the phone in the picture? So while I was trying to compare pictures of Bart to the person on the boat that I can't identify, I found this picture with him with a tattoo from about 2 years ago. And it wasn't until just today that I stopped looking at the tattoo and I started looking at his wrist. Because someone in the background of this picture has always stuck out to me because my instinct always was like, is that Bart? Bart seemingly has a pretty pronounced mullet as according to this picture, but this was definitely not on Bart's boat. I checked the seating and the covers, like it's not Bart's boat. Now I think you pretty much get where I'm going with this because then I remembered this bracelet. Pretty unique bracelet. Unique like the bracelet that Bart Jr. was wearing in that tattoo picture. And right here looks like it might be the tail end of a tattoo that wraps around the forearm, right in the same place that it would be on Bart. I've said for a while now that the story about them calling Bart that morning to go out on the boat never made sense, because what 21-year-old didn't already have plans for 4th of July? So then the question is, who is driving Bart's boat? Which brings me back to this guy who some people have thought looked like Bart. However, we do know that he was on Bart's boat handing out drinks to people in that 7-second clip we've seen. Same hair, same glasses, same hat. By the way, did y'all know that Bart has a younger brother? The family resemblance is very striking. I mean, the real difference is that he's a little bit shorter and has a squarer jaw. And does anybody want to guess what his younger brother's name is? Brooks. Now, I seem to remember, and I can't remember exactly the context, a certain somebody talking in an interview about his buddy Brooks. Thanks to this interview, I was able to finally, definitively put faces and names together, and then it hit me. We now know for sure that this is Jax. And now we know for sure that this is Morgan. He's literally wearing the same hat and the exact same armbands. So why aren't they on the Triton? A very unique blue swimsuit and an orange and yellow swimsuit. And now, thanks to Officer Tatum, we finally have a very clear video of them calling for the Cito. And, I don't see an orange swimsuit anywhere. I don't see a paisley swimsuit anywhere. So where are Jax and Morgan on this boat? We see what looks like Jax cuddling up to Katie on Bart's boat. So is this Bart over on their boat? Because here he was in that video handing out beers from his boat, and the sunglasses and the hat look the same. But what if it's not? Just stick with me, I'm going to come back around to it. Because now I want to talk about Warren's 17-year-old brother, Carter. Carter, who we know got into a fight with someone and put someone in an armbar on the shore. Carter, who Warren said he told to come over and hang out with all of them and chill out. Carter, who practices Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Notice the hand placement. And if you're like me, I had to go look up and see what an armbar exactly is and how it is done. And oh, look at the placement of that arm. Yeah. Now this seems to me like it definitely could be Carter. Picture was just taken in December, so the haircut, the hairline, the body type, all of it. We also know that the person in the red shorts were on the shore when the fight happened. Now, y'all remember this picture, the Katie Snapchat pictures? Well, I brightened it up. All I did was just pump up the exposure, nothing else. And look in the background here. Oh, red shorts, just like I said. Lighter colored hair with a very familiar looking back of the neck. Now, of course, I'm not saying whether this is or isn't Carter. Boy, this wouldn't look good for anybody if this is Carter on Katie's boat at 6:02. But you know, one underexposed, blurry picture a smoking gun does not make. Unless somebody with a very unique haircut and a very distinct piece of jewelry happens to show up in one of these pictures. Because Mullet Boy here has always bothered me because for some reason he's wearing what looks like jeans. Not saying they are jeans, just can't definitively prove one way or the other whether they are or not, or if it's just the design of the swim trunks. When I went back through some of the photos I had collected of Bart Jr. to try and figure out if this was him or not, I found this picture I had archived. Thanks to the tattoo in this picture, which is the reason I screen grabbed it, that's why I'm like, I don't think this is Bart, because I feel like I would see the tattoo there, but and mind you, this picture is a couple of years old, but I just kind of wanted a timeline for this tattoo for identification purposes. And then I stopped getting distracted by the tattoo on his arm, and I looked at the bracelet on his wrist. Pretty unique set of bracelets, right? I mean, hopefully by now you've figured out where I'm going with this. Why, what a unique set of bracelets. So between the mullet and these bracelets, someone may come to the conclusion that Katie and Bart were on a boat together. Maybe not Bart's boat, because after all, they're claiming that this boat belonged to a Marty McGrath, who's the one who came and got people. But if that's Bart here, then who was driving Bart's boat? Did you guys know that Bart has a younger brother? Very similar looking, but I'll tell you what, very different jawlines. Almost like the jawline of this person on the Triton. And guess what his brother's name is? Brooks. Now, where have I heard that before? Hasn't somebody talked about my buddy Brooks in previous interviews? I always said the whole "we called Bart that morning" story didn't make fucking sense. I have a theory that I'm flushing out. But thanks for doing this interview, guys. Wouldn't have been able to figure this out without you. But you know, since we're all liars and grifters anyway, just a reminder to everybody to check out my link in my bio if you want to support my work. I told you that lawyer was giving away the game when he kept saying just their three names over and over again.
For a moment, take away the emotions surrounding the case and look at one argument on its own. Buried inside this interview is a point that deserves to be examined for what it actually says and what it doesn't. Jax's reasoning is fairly straightforward. If the group had knowingly killed a friend aboard their boat, why would they contact STO, a private towing company, and create another record of what was happening? Why involve the Coast Guard, a federal agency capable of bringing additional scrutiny to the situation? And if this group had really carried out a murder and then successfully concealed it, why, weeks later, had none of them been taken into custody? Jax's own point is essentially that they aren't criminal masterminds. Pulling off a killing and an elaborate cover-up while surrounded by witnesses would require a level of planning and sophistication that nobody has publicly established this group possessed. That argument should be considered as an actual piece of reasoning, not simply dismissed as a denial from someone defending his friends. In a courtroom, a defense attorney could make a version of the same argument. And on its own terms, it has some logical strength. Someone who had intentionally killed another person would generally have a reason to avoid creating additional records, witnesses, and official involvement, at the very moment investigators might later examine. The documented sequence matters here. The group contacted a towing service and they declined Coast Guard assistance twice. Those details come from the recorded call examined throughout this investigation. Taken together, that behavior can be viewed as more consistent with a genuine boating emergency than with an elaborate attempt to manufacture a false explanation. So yes, the argument has weight. But there is an important distinction between what it challenges and what it actually establishes. It provides a strong argument against one very specific theory that the group intentionally killed Nolan aboard the boat and then deliberately contacted authorities as part of a carefully constructed cover story. But that is a much narrower claim than proving what ultimately happened to Nolan. Other possibilities do not necessarily depend on someone knowing at the time of the call that a deliberate murder had occurred. An accidental drowning after the group had already left, a confrontation that escalated beyond what anyone intended, or a situation in which Nolan was in serious danger and those around him failed to recognize or respond to the severity of what was happening. None of those scenarios require the premeditated murder and cover-up theory that Jax is specifically challenging. That means his reasoning can be persuasive against No official investigator, the sheriff's office, the district attorney, or Crump's legal team has publicly established the specific theory that Jax is arguing against. That Nolan was deliberately murdered aboard the boat and that the subsequent calls were part of a calculated cover-up. So, in one sense, Jax has offered a substantial rebuttal. But he's rebutting a theory that has not been officially established as the central explanation for what happened. And that distinction becomes even more important when examining Warren's visual argument, which follows a remarkably similar line of reasoning. The boat footage and the audio dispute. Warren's argument begins with something viewers can actually examine for themselves: the footage captured during the emergency call. In the visible portions of the boat, the people on board appear relatively calm. They seem to be carrying on with ordinary activities. There is no obvious gathering around a body, no visible panic, and no clear reaction that would immediately suggest a catastrophic event had just occurred in that confined space. If that accurately represents what was happening during the relevant timestamp, it is a legitimate piece of evidence worth considering. Unlike a second-hand account describing someone's mood, video provides a direct record of how people appear to behave at a particular moment. But there is an important limitation. His position is that Warren's decision to contact the Coast Guard is difficult to reconcile with a straightforward consciousness of guilt theory, that is, a recognized form of legal reasoning. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike can consider a person's voluntary decision to involve law enforcement as behavioral evidence. Someone attempting to conceal a serious crime would generally have an incentive to minimize additional official attention, not voluntarily bring it closer to the situation. That doesn't prove innocence, but it is a rational factor to weigh. The interview becomes more complicated when it moves into the broader accusation that thousands of people are being misled, along with the more specific allegation that the emergency recording was deliberately manipulated to manufacture Nolan's voice. That claim requires a different level of scrutiny. The question isn't simply which side sounds more convincing. The recording itself has already been subjected to independent forensic examination, and that examination produced specific concerns that need to be separated from the larger claims surrounding the case. Robert Freed, the digital forensics expert who has repeatedly analyzed material connected to this investigation, identified technical discrepancies involving TMZ's enhanced version of the recording. According to the analysis discussed in the series, the processed file was approximately 20 seconds longer than the original MDMR release, contained a different digital fingerprint, and included redactions that did not correspond with the original file. Those are legitimate authentication concerns about that particular processed recording, but they do not automatically establish that the audio was fabricated. And they also do not establish that the disputed recording proves Nolan was murdered. Freed's position was considerably narrower. He said he could not independently corroborate the disputed phrases, while the characteristics of the file raised enough questions about its authenticity and processing that it should not simply be treated as unquestionable evidence. That distinction matters, because Warren's claim is broader than what the forensic analysis actually established, and when the two are placed side by side, the responsible conclusion is not that one side has definitively won the audio dispute. It is that the recording contains unresolved questions, and those questions need to be answered through evidence, not certainty or conviction. That is where the argument becomes much more difficult to dismiss, because the issue is no longer about who sounds more persuasive, it's about what the original evidence can actually prove. The difference between unverified and fabricated. Warren describes the recording as completely enhanced and fabricated, and he delivers that conclusion with absolute certainty. But that language goes beyond what the forensic analysis discussed in this case has actually established. Freed did not conclude that the recording was fake or deliberately manufactured. His position was narrower. The specific viral version could not be authenticated against the original recording. That is a legitimate technical concern, but it is not the same conclusion as proving fabrication. And that distinction matters because this series has repeatedly criticized the opposite kind of overstatement. TMZ's viral interpretation, Nancy Grace's confident presentation of the transcript, and commentary from other channels claiming they could definitively identify Nolan's voice, all moved beyond what the underlying evidence could independently establish. The same evidentiary standard has to apply here. But there is a legitimate criticism buried inside Warren's broader argument, and separating it from the stronger accusation is important. Warren points out that there has been no demonstrated chain of custody or independently established automated transcription process for the particular enhanced transcript that circulated online. Questioning how specific words were attributed to specific speakers is reasonable. That concern also connects to an issue raised earlier in this investigation by Todd Shipley: expectation bias. When viewers are shown a transcript before hearing ambiguous audio, their brains can become primed to search for the words they've already been told are present. Once the supposed phrase appears on screen, unclear sounds can suddenly seem to match it. That is a genuine methodological concern, particularly when dealing with heavily processed or difficult to understand recordings. So Warren is justified in questioning the methodology. Where his argument goes further than the evidence is in treating those problems as proof that the recording was fabricated. The available information supports skepticism and further authentication. It does not automatically establish intentional manufacture. And that same distinction becomes important when looking at Ed Pollock's argument about the timeline. Unlike the audio dispute, Pollock's claim is based on an alleged eyewitness account. That requires a different kind of evaluation. Pollock says two witnesses, whose identities have not been publicly disclosed, described as credible, longtime acquaintances of Nolan, reported seeing him alive at approximately 5:50 p.m. If that account is accurate, it could be highly significant. The reason is simple. The boys reportedly left the island at approximately 4:30 p.m. A credible sighting of Nolan, roughly 90 minutes later, could establish that he was alive and apparently functioning after the group had already departed. That would matter enormously to any theory suggesting something happened to Nolan on the boat itself or immediately before the boat left the island. But there is a major evidentiary limitation. The witnesses remain unnamed in the interview, and the account is being presented through an attorney speaking on behalf of the young men involved. That does not mean the witnesses are unreliable. It means the public has not yet been given the opportunity to independently evaluate the claim. Pollock describes them as highly reliable and respected members of the community, and strongly rejects the possibility that they simply made a mistake. That is advocacy. It's exactly the kind of language an attorney would use when attempting to strengthen the credibility of evidence favorable to his clients. The underlying account could still be completely genuine. But at this stage, it has not been subjected to the kind of independent verification this investigation has repeatedly emphasized: named witnesses, corroborating evidence, documented interviews, or direct confirmation from investigators. If those witnesses have actually been interviewed by the sheriff's department, questioned through the grand jury process, or independently verified by Nolan's family's investigative team, their account could become a meaningful piece of the timeline. For now, however, it remains an allegation presented during an interview. And there's an important irony here. Pollock's own broader argument is that the public should distinguish evidence from speculation. That same standard has to apply to evidence that happens to support his side: the legal threats and the limits of defamation. At this stage, the witness account remains an assertion without independently verifiable evidence attached to it, in the format presented to the public, and that creates an important tension in the interview. Pollock repeatedly builds his credibility argument around the idea that his side deals in facts, documentation, and evidence. Yet at the same time, he presents an unnamed witness account as highly reliable without giving viewers enough information to independently test that claim. That contradiction becomes especially important as the interview moves into its most legally aggressive territory: the threats of defamation litigation against critics whose identities have not necessarily been made public. Pollock's legal strategy is forceful and confident, but when examined strictly as legal reasoning rather than courtroom-style performance, it is considerably more complicated than the certainty of his language suggests. His framework starts with absolute confidence in his clients. He repeatedly describes them as completely innocent, with zero wrongdoing, and goes so far as to suggest that even the criminal law standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't adequately capture the certainty he has about their position. Alongside that, he warns people who have allegedly made false statements about Morgan, Jax, or Warren that they could face legal consequences. As public advocacy, that is not unusual for a defamation attorney. A lawyer can use such statements to discourage harassment, warn potential defendants, and communicate that his clients intend to defend their reputations aggressively, but defamation law has specific requirements, and those requirements matter. Pollock's language occasionally appears to blur the distinction between statements that are actually false and damaging, and statements that he simply considers unfair, offensive, or unsupported. Legally, defamation generally involves a false statement of fact communicated to another person that causes legally recognizable harm. When the subject involves public concern, additional constitutional protections can apply, and depending on the plaintiff's status, the required level of fault can include negligence or the more demanding actual malice standard. That is a much higher threshold than someone posting online that these young men may know more than they have publicly disclosed. Speculation can be protected. Opinion can be protected. Even harsh criticism can receive First Amendment protection, particularly when the speaker makes clear that they are expressing an opinion rather than presenting an allegation as an established fact. And when a case has become a matter of legitimate public concern, discussions surrounding the people involved can receive substantial constitutional protection. So Pollack's sweeping suggestion that anyone who brings a lawsuit against Jax, Warren, or Morgan will automatically lose and be forced to pay legal fees should be understood for what it is: advocacy. It is not a neutral prediction of how every potential lawsuit would be decided. Ironically, that absolute certainty resembles the same problem this investigation has repeatedly identified in statements from other sides of the case, from public figures making categorical claims to online commentators insisting they have already solved every unanswered question. But there is also a legitimate legal point underneath Pollack's aggressive presentation. If an identifiable person published a specific, objectively false factual allegation stating that one of these young men directly caused Nolan's death and presented that allegation as established fact rather than speculation, that could potentially create a viable defamation claim, particularly if the statement caused measurable reputational or financial harm, and the interview describes allegations of real-world consequences, including threats, confrontations, and reported denials of service. If those consequences were directly caused by false statements of fact, that is precisely the type of reputational injury defamation law is designed to address. But the crucial question would be whether a particular statement actually crossed the legal line. Was it an assertion of fact? Was it provably false? Was it communicated to others? Did it cause legally recognizable harm? What level of fault applied? Those questions would have to be examined individually. There is no blanket rule that transforms every accusation, criticism, or online theory surrounding a high-profile case into actionable defamation. And that distinction becomes even more important when the conversation turns to the racial component Pollack raises, because that issue introduces an entirely different set of legal and constitutional questions, and it may be one of the most complicated arguments made anywhere in this interview: race, profit, and the public battle over the case. Pollack's response to the racial question is more restrained in one important respect. He says he does not want to speculate about the motives of individual people, while suggesting that racism for profit and outrage for profit may help explain why certain narratives gain traction online. As a theory about digital incentives, that argument is coherent. Outrage generates attention, attention generates engagement, and engagement can generate revenue for creators operating across the online media ecosystem. That dynamic is not unique to this case, and this investigation has already documented examples of sensational coverage surrounding Nolan's death, including thumbnails claiming confessions or arrests that never actually occurred. So, there is legitimate evidence that profit-driven sensationalism has influenced parts of the coverage. But two things can be true at the same time. Some creators may exploit racial tension or outrage because it produces clicks, while other people may errorize concerns about race because they sincerely believe racial dynamics deserve examination in cases like this. The second issue is not merely an internet theory. Questions about racial disparities in investigations, prosecutions, and media coverage have been documented across decades. Public statements from figures including Al Sharpton and the NAACP have also raised broader concerns surrounding how Nolan's death has been handled and discussed. That means treating every person who mentions race as someone secretly chasing money or attention would require evidence of that individual's actual motive. Without that evidence, the accusation risks committing the same mistake Pollack is criticizing in others, claiming certainty about someone's intentions when the available information cannot establish what is happening inside that person's mind. But beneath all of the legal arguments and competing interpretations, there is one practical issue that does not depend on resolving every disputed question. 3 young men who have not been charged with a crime are reportedly dealing with serious public and personal consequences. The interview describes threats directed at family members, confrontations in public places, and incidents involving restaurants and stores. Those reported safety concerns matter regardless of whether every legal argument Pollack makes would ultimately succeed in court. They also matter regardless of which interpretation of the disputed evidence eventually proves correct. You don't need to decide the entire case to recognize that unproven accusations can have consequences for real people. And stepping back from the individual claims, the interview reveals something larger about how this case has been fought in public over the past 2 months. The friend group's side is now using the same basic communication machinery that virtually every other major participant in this story has relied upon. It is confident, it is emotionally charged, it is carefully presented through a sympathetic media platform, and its purpose is not simply to place neutral facts on the record. It is also an attempt to influence how the public understands the people at the center of the controversy. That isn't unique to Pollock or his clients. It has been part of the public battle surrounding this case from the beginning. Trump's public appearances followed a similar structure: absolute confidence, emotionally forceful language, direct appeals to the audience, and repeated suggestions that opposing voices were acting dishonestly or in bad faith. Pollock's closing message, emphasizing virtue, honesty, integrity, and truth, uses a remarkably similar rhetorical framework. The difference is not necessarily the communication strategy, the difference is which side is using it. And that may be one of the most revealing things about this interview. The people defending the friend group have now entered the same public information war that has surrounded Nolan's case from the very beginning. But the evidence actually tells us, recognizing that parallel does not mean both sides are equally correct or equally wrong about what happened to Nolan Wells. It means something more important. More than 7 weeks into this case, the underlying truth about Nolan's death remains largely separate from who has delivered the more compelling interview, who sounds more confident, or who makes the stronger emotional appeal to the public. That distinction is critical. The strongest evidence to emerge throughout this investigation has generally come from sources that have little or no interest in winning the public argument. GPS records can establish where the boat actually traveled. Forensic pathologists can explain how decomposition affects what an autopsy can and cannot determine. An arrest record can document that Joseph Dumas was charged with threatening Judge Cole. Official incident reports can establish when authorities arrived, what they observed, and how the case was initially handled. Those records can be examined independently. They exist regardless of who gives the more persuasive interview. They do not depend on believing someone's character, sincerity, or confidence. This interview is different. It contains testimony. It contains personal experiences. It contains arguments that deserve to be heard. But testimony, even sincere testimony, is not automatically equivalent to a GPS record, an official report, or a forensic expert's technical explanation. That distinction doesn't make the interview worthless. In fact, some of what Pollock describes is consistent with an already documented problem surrounding this case: threats and harassment directed toward people connected to the story. Those concerns deserve attention regardless of where the investigation ultimately leads. Jax's argument about the Coast Guard call also remains a legitimate point. The decision to involve outside assistance is meaningful evidence against one narrow theory, that the group intentionally killed Nolan on the boat and then deliberately created an emergency response as part of a cover story. But it does not eliminate every other possible explanation for what happened. And then there is the alleged 5:50 p.m. sighting. If Nolan was genuinely seen alive at that time, and investigators eventually confirm the account independently, it could become an important addition to the timeline this investigation has been tracking for weeks. But right now, the claim remains at the stage where an attorney is describing what unnamed witnesses allegedly told his side. That is potentially significant. It is not yet independently established. And that brings the analysis back to the same standard that should apply to everyone involved in this case. From Nolan's family's legal team, to Nancy Grace's forensic discussions, to independent creators whose GPS theories have already been challenged, certainty is not the same thing as proof. Zero wrongdoing, zero chance. Nothing beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are powerful words. They can be effective advocacy, and advocacy has a legitimate purpose, particularly when people are facing genuine harassment or threats. But this case has demonstrated repeatedly how statements delivered with absolute confidence can later require additional context once the underlying evidence is examined more closely. That has happened with audio interpretations. It has happened with forensic conclusions. It has happened with online theories. It has happened with legal arguments. And it has happened with statements from people on virtually every side of the story. There is no reason to lower that standard now, simply because the confident voice belongs to a side that has received less national attention until this point. So where does that leave this interview? It provides an important human account of grief, fear, and reported harassment. It presents legitimate arguments about the Coast Guard response. It raises reasonable questions about the authentication and interpretation of the emergency audio. And it offers an eyewitness account that could become genuinely significant if investigators independently verify it. But alongside those points are legal conclusions and witness claims that still require the same verification demanded of every other piece of evidence in this investigation. Nolan Wells' official cause of death remains sealed pending the grand jury process. And whatever these 3 young men did or did not do that day has not, as of this interview, been conclusively established by an authority with access to all the evidence. That uncertainty is uncomfortable. But it is also the most honest position available. because sympathy for people experiencing real suffering does not require abandoning the discipline of separating compelling testimony from independently verified fact. And in the case where so many voices are demanding certainty, that distinction may be more important than ever.